Whether you're playing Tearlements or trying to beat the deck, you're not going to want to miss this video. In today's video, we're going to be going over how to beat Tearlament Ishizus either when you're on Ishizu Tearlament or you're on another deck. And I'm not just going to be covering card choices because there's so many videos out there on that, but rather I'm going to be going over different technical plays, different reads, and deck building choices that you can make in order to have the best shot against the best deck of the format. So if you guys enjoy this type of content, be sure to let me know by leaving a like, commenting, and subscribing. With that being said, we're going to start off first with going over some general tips for people who are not playing Tearlaments. So if you're not on Tearlaments, a couple of things that you should consider when you're building your deck. One of the things I think you should consider is actually siding copies of Keldo and Medora in your side deck 3 and 3, which just makes it so when you play against the Tearlament strategy, it makes it so their Ishizu cards get a lot less value against you because now they are afraid to mill cards from their deck. Because now you can punish them with these shufflers to shuffle back their Tearlament names and other resources. So by putting these in your deck, it turns off essentially a very powerful part of the Ishizu Tearlaments. And even if you happen to see them, like if you see them in multiples, they are just free level 4 extenders. Worst case scenario, you can use them as discard fodder and shuffle back some of your own resources. Yes, I understand this is a brick if you're not playing like other fairies in your deck, but I think it's a fair price to pay in order to actually have a better chance against the Ishizu Tearlaments. So while these are cards that actually reward you for when your opponent mills, you should also consider the bestial monsters. So with the bestial monsters, there's a big problem with a card like Magnamut. Magnamut, if it's milled from your deck to the grave by the opponent's Ishizu cards, it makes it so now they have a very valuable target off of Dark Charmer to take, and you don't want to be giving them something like that. While Magnamut is incredibly powerful, if you're playing a non-Tearlament deck, and let's just say you have space for like 3 or so bestial monsters, instead of like the standard maybe 2 Magnamut, 1 Druisworm, you may want to consider something like 2 Druisworm, 1 Saronir. Even though they're worse, quote unquote worse than Magnamut, they make it so it's harder to get punished by your Ishizu tier opponent, whether it be through like Ishizu milling Magnamut or like your opponent's triggering their Havness when you activate Magnamut on field effect. So definitely something else that you want to consider. So overall, just playing cards that either punish your opponent for milling you or make it so you don't get punished if your opponents use the Ishizu cards on you. Definitely very important things to consider when you're deck building, and something hopefully any deck in the format can really play in order to punish the opponents. On the topic of the 2 shufflers, you also want to consider playing decks that don't really lose to these cards. Against the Ishizu tiers, they're going to be milling a lot of cards and just getting these 2 into the graveyard a lot, which means they're essentially going to have a triple quote-unquote DD Crow in their graveyard pretty much almost at all times. If possible, try not playing decks that lose to this card, like a single shuffle back. So for example, it's a very quick example off the top of my head, something like Zombies, for example, with like Mizuki and like Doom King Balrog, whatever. It's not really that relevant, but the idea is like you want to make sure that your deck is able to beat these shufflers, because you just should always expect your opponent to have access to them with all the mills that they're getting access to. So a deck like Fluandereeze, one of the reasons it's so good is because the shufflers do absolutely nothing to the deck, and the deck can play like a lot of tier hate cards. So just something to consider when you're picking your deck in order to actually play in this format. So that's going to do it for the non-Tearlament strategies. So what if you're actually playing Ishizu tiers? How do you beat the mirror? So in the mirror match, another point about the shufflers, you just want to be careful about the names that you're triggering. If you see your opponent have these 2 in their graveyard, you're going to want to be careful with the names you use, in the sense that you don't want to get punished by using a bunch of names in a single chain and then having your opponent just shuffle them all back and crippling your plays for the rest of the turn. So it's very easy tip to remember is if you see one of these shufflers in your opponent's grave, use 1 effect max. So like either Rhino Heart or like any of the fusion tiers, because 9 times out of 10 your opponent's going to shuffle the one that you use back, unless you very obviously like have access to another one on the board or something. So definitely something to consider. You just don't want to get punished by playing super hard into these. Something very easy for all tier players to remember. It's another important thing to remember is against Herald of Orange Light, people are not going to want to hit like your Rhino Heart or your Kick Callus or something just because it gets value out of it. So if you're able to like chain block effects somehow with when you're fusion something, so for example, let's say you mill 3, you have access to like a fusion monster, and then you have like a scream or a solid to trigger. You just always want to chain block the monster just because to play around a card like Herald of Orange Light. You just don't want to get punished for that. Same idea as like if you start, let's just say instant fusion, go for Kikalos. Kikalos adds Merly, summons itself. You want to use the Merly as chain link too, so it makes it harder for your opponent to actually get full value off of their Herald of Orange Light. Same idea if you're playing Herald of Orange Light, just be aware of those opportunities that you will have to actually use this. It's not great in the mirror, and that sort of bridges on to my next point. Herald of Orange Light, for the most part, is only really good when I feel like your opponent's hand is particularly weak and it's very obvious that like they don't have any other plays. Most of the other times you're gonna want to try to save it for a card like Abyss Dweller or like one of the shufflers in the graveyard on your turn. So that's just another tip about Herald of Orange Light. Just reconsider its purpose and its usefulness in the mirror match. It's definitely a card that you can actually side out in the mirror match because it's not that great, honestly, most of the time. Like I mentioned, for example, if you're trading with like a Tearlament name, it's just going to be like a 2-for-1. You just have to discard like a shuffler for you to get full value off of it. Another thing as a tip for the mirror, you probably don't want to be using the mill effects unless you absolutely have to. A lot of the times, they're going to be able to play on your turn by milling cards. So like, for example, if they Bastille you, that's fine. They're not really doing anything else like setting up a board on your turn. But for example, if you start letting them mill, that's when it gets crazy and they start doing stuff on your turn, and you just don't want that to happen. So unless your hand is very bad, I would not recommend using these effects. Speaking of these two effects, you also want to keep in mind Kelbeck's ability is incredibly good in the mirror match. Because every turn your opponent's going to be sending something from hand or deck to the graveyard. This just means it's able to force out something like Royal Kalos. It's able to punish your opponents for playing poorly around it, for example. So like if they make Abyss Dweller and then they do stuff after that, yeah, you can just punish them with Kelbeck with bouncing back the Dweller. It's also something to keep in mind when you're the person setting up the Dweller. You don't want to be doing anything that can trigger Kelbeck afterwards, because most of the times players should be holding this for their like their own turn, unless they see like the perfect opportunity to bounce the Dweller back. So just keep in mind that you don't want to be playing into Kelbeck when you're actually trying to set up your board with Abyss Dweller. You also want to consider sliding out like all your copies of Yugioh, honestly, in the mirror match. Yugioh just isn't that good. If you're never milling, like, you don't need it. And two, its effect in hand is just rarely ever going to come up. It's only really good if you start with like something like Keldo Kelbeck, where you can go like Keldo, pitch Kelbeck, summon, search Yugioh, Kelbeck mill, and then summon Yugioh out and summon it back. But the problem with that is you're giving your opponents mills, so just something to consider, siding out Yugioh, siding out Orange Light as well. So just keeping like Kelbeck, 3 Kelbecks and the 3 shufflers, which is pretty optimized for the mirror match in my opinion. So definitely do consider that. That's going to do it for the tiers mirror specific advice. But now some general like reads or technical plays that you should be able to pick up on, no matter if you're playing Tearlements or not. So the very first thing is if your very first Tearlament name, or like your first like valuable light or dark monster in the graveyard, like it goes through, your opponent doesn't Bastille it, you can assume that most likely they don't have a Bastille. So what I mean is, like, if you normal summon Rhinoheart send a Tearlament, activate the Tearlament. If your opponent doesn't Bastille you there, it's likely they don't have it. There are players who will hold it, of course, but I would say 9 times out of 10, the average player is going to use it at that time. So unless you're playing against like world-class players, you're probably going to be safe to assume that your opponent's going to Bastille the very first name that you put in the graveyard. So if you're able to get past that trick, but then you know you shouldn't really have to play through Bastilles for the rest of the turn. Another thing with Tearlaments Happiness, if your very first on-field monster effect goes through without a hitch, you can just assume your opponent doesn't have Happiness. The reason why most players will shotgun Happiness is because they want to set up a board before you get a chance to set up your own. So before you get a chance to set up Dweller, for example, or like roll Kalos to negate it, they're probably just going to activate the Happiness in order to get it out and start milling their cards from the deck. Another tip that is related to Happiness is you want to chain block your on-field effects any way possible. So for example, if you like summon Kikalos, you can go like Kikalos 1, field spell 2, or something like that. Just to make it so your opponent can't ever Happiness you, because Happiness can punish very, very hard. By just putting a Tearlament name on the field, as well as just milling anything from like millers, to shufflers or Tearlament cards, and it's just honestly insane. So you want to avoid that if possible by playing around the Havness as best as you can. I guess also a general tip, I know I mentioned it during the tier specific section, but it's just so important to mention again. Be aware of Kelbeck. Kelbeck can out your like floodgate monsters like Abyss Dweller and something like Baguska. So you just want to be wary of the actions that you're doing when you suspect that your opponent might have a Kelbeck. Kelbeck's just able to out those problematic monsters while putting a level 4 body on board. So it's very important that you're able to play around this to the best of your ability. Some other general reads now that you might get on your opponent. So I know I mentioned you never want to be blind milling with these guys in any matchup unless you know for sure your opponent's not on Tearlaments. But if your opponent doesn't know what you're playing and you see them activate any of these effects in the graveyard, you should have a good idea of the strength, the relative strength of their hand. Their hand is probably weak enough to the point where they feel that they need this in order to keep playing. And that's going to be the case sometimes in the Tearlaments strategy, because by trading all your like extenders for like the Ishizu cards, you're gonna have slightly weaker hands at times, even though your mills will be a lot more insane. So definitely something to consider. If you, for example, see them milling, you may want to consider stopping their very first name in order to just cut them off from their fusion plays in the first place. Another thing is also, if your opponent's starting with a card like Tearlaments Merly in order to fusion summon, you can also presume that their hand is pretty weak, because most of the times players are going to want to save Merly in order to use a card like Sprint later on, just because it's the most accessible name out of all the Tearlament names. So if your opponent starts a Merly, that means their hand is probably bad enough to the point where they won't be able to get to other names without resolving that Merly first, which means if you have a way to stop that fusion summon, so like a Bestial or like DD Crow or whatever, Skullmeister, you're going to want to use it on that Merly just because your opponent's hand is most likely to be weak. That's going to do it for a quick rundown of some technical play, reads, and deck building choices for whether you're playing Tearlaments or playing against them. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know if you think there are any other important tips I missed in the comment section below. Whether you're new to the deck or a master with the deck, I hope everyone learned a little bit of something. If you guys enjoyed this video, please remember to leave a like, comment, and subscribe, because it really helps keep me motivated to keep posting more videos like this. And with that being said, I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.